He has released a discussion document which outlines steps that could bolster growth and address unemployment in the country. The Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's 77-page policy paper details his plans to boost South Africa's economy. Now, members of the public have also been invited to give comment. Let's discuss this a little bit further, and I am joined in the studio tonight by Economist Sifiso Skenjana from Afra Consultants. A very good evening to you, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What has been the general reception of this policy paper from economists and analysts alike?
I think, you know, it's progress. It's a step in the right direction, particularly because, you know, there was a lot of kind of kicking and screaming around the sauna where we didn't get any detail around how the policymakers envisaged driving economic growth and the levers that they thought were available to them to drive economic growth. And now, you know, when you look at this particular paper, it starts to talk the language that I think is progressive and conducive for how we ought to imagine, I think, driving South Africa into sustainable economic growth out of the low growth trap we're in. So you see, for example, conversations around employment multipliers and saying which sectors are employment intensive and therefore you need to target investments towards those sectors. You hear around network sectors, and so those are energy, roads, rail, water, and how those sectors contribute to kind of the social wage in the economy, as well as the economic growth conversation as well. And so I think in context of that, it's certainly a step in the right direction where we're getting a lot more granularity than coming from the policymakers around what they imagine the levers are available for growth.
So perhaps let's look at these network systems that he talks about and how he phrases them as like modernizing these network industries. Now, we do know that these are key industries as far as the growth of the country is concerned, yeah. But there are also a lot of key challenges in those very sectors, energy being key amongst them, with Eskom having been identified as perhaps the biggest risk to the economy with the debt that they're in at the moment. Won't you talk us through some of the possible solutions that have been proposed in this policy document?
So, I mean, Eskom certainly is a material risk for the economy. We've seen, for example, that, you know, in terms of the liabilities and you know, Eskom makes up about 50% of you know, the debt that South Africa has pledged. And so that is a material risk. We now at least are getting progress in terms of what's happening in Eskom with the chief restructuring officer and what they plan to do in terms of turning around the issue at Eskom. We know that as a result of Eskom, the government borrowing program is probably going to accelerate faster than they had anticipated, but at least there's some work now that's starting to feel a little bit more tangible around what's happening to turn around Eskom. And of course, we've always spoken around the challenge that Eskom is currently faced with not being able to charge cost-reflective prices, which is the prices that allow them to recover the cost of generating and transmission and distributing electricity.
Let's look at some of the novel ideas here, and that is private sector as well as private individuals now being able to sell electricity. Talk to us about some of those options and some of the novel alternatives that he presented.
I think, you know, I always say the story of Eskom being a strategic asset in the economy is always an important one, and this is why we've heard around how Eskom is too big to fail. We've seen in global economies, other global economies, when they did try to privatize their energy grid, the prices of energy skyrocketed, and that was not conducive for growth, and they've tried to bring back that electricity into private hands. And so when we look at some of those solutions, then we need to see them in context around how, one, we're still going to be able to price electricity in an affordable way, one, from a developmental point of view, because Eskom's got a dual mandate, both development as well as economic growth. And so how will those solutions have an impact on the price points from an Eskom point of view? And also then how will they bring innovation and new sources or new ways of generating you know, electricity supply for the economy?
So let's do this. So we're going to take a quick break, but after after the break, let's look at the suggestions that have been put from the telecommunications sector, as well as what SMMEs have in store for us and what he proposes. Do stay with us. This is News at Prime. Now, after the break, we'll review the G7 summit as well as its impact on the continent with Professor Chris Landsberg, and also conclude our conversation with Mr. Sifiso. Do stay with us. Good evening and thank you for staying with us. This is News at Prime. Now, the National Treasury has released a discussion document which outlines steps that could bolster growth and also address the unemployment problem that we're currently facing in South Africa. Now, we are in discussion this evening with Mr. Sifiso Skenjana from Afra Consultants, and we are talking about the policy document that was released by the Minister of Finance. Now, before the break, we spoke quite at length about Eskom, but there are other key industries that he spoke about, SMMEs, for example, Telkom, Transnet. A brief summary.
So Telkom, it's really around opening up spectrum. And there's a policy document that's already under review around the ways in which we're going to open up spectrum. And so that's going to be quite interesting for the competitive landscape for that particular industry. And we know that it's been oligopolistic in one way or another. And with SMEs, again, we saw a week ago that the government currently owes SMEs about 7 billion rand. And if you look specifically to the Eastern Cape, it's about 2 billion rand. That's just one province. And so, again, there's, we really have to get serious around how we put in place real plans around, paying those invoices, making sure that we've got hard dates. If it's a 30-day turnaround strategy, and then we make sure that we turn around in those 30 days, and there's a penal code around non-compliance around that. And so that's going to be quite important as well in terms of making sure that SMEs stay viable and stay viable contributors, particularly from an employment point of view.
And Transnet, allowing private competition for Transnet as well, that was quite an interesting one, because it looks like they're looking at the state-owned enterprises and seeing how they will make sure that there's no monopoly in the state-owned enterprises by introducing competition and private players in that space. So
interestingly, I mean, monopolies, there's a place for monopolies. We call them natural monopolies, and one of the things, particularly when you can vertically integrate those monopolies, the benefit that's usually associated with them is the ability to be able to drive prices down, because you get economies of scale. The challenges that we found with Transnet particularly is that they haven't invested, right? And therefore we haven't been able to make use and take advantage of the rail network that we've got, which is the largest on the continent. And so it's important now that we open up those opportunities to ensure that that Transnet, I think, also understands that there's a competitive landscape in which they play, but also to be able to remove the burden off the road. I mean, 80% of the cargo that we see in the country is on the roads, and therefore that's why you're seeing so many trucks there, and yet we've got such a wide rail system in the country. So it becomes important to explore those opportunities to ensure that we can move the rail, the cargo off the road, and ensure also then safety of human beings on the road as well.
Mr. Skejana, thank you so much for your time this evening. Very much appreciated.